What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking quite possibly one of the most popular and polarizing questions that everyone has leading up to their drafts. And that is, what is the best pick to have in your fantasy football draft and why? Now, before we break that down, a quick reminder, if you haven't already, go ahead, get yourself a copy of the 2019 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. It's got great tips like this when it comes to draft day. It also has player positional breakdowns, top 150 overall players, standard PPR formats, individual player bios, and more. Check out the description for more information. But for now, let's get into our conversation for the day. So when it comes to answering a question like what's the best draft pick to have in your fantasy football drafts, I think first we have to go ahead and consider two of the biggest variables that go into this before we can go ahead and give a concrete answer. And one of those is, what year are you drafting in? Obviously right now we're talking about the 2019 fantasy football season. So whatever conclusion we come up with won't necessarily be one that we can translate to last season, or for that matter, for the 2020 season next year. And that's simply because the fantasy football landscape is so fluid due to things like injuries to big time players, suspensions, trades during the offseason, an influx of new talent via rookies, and because, you're going to have ranking differentials from year to year, breakout players, disappointing players. So for that reason, this is going to be on a year-to-year basis type of question that you're going to be asking. And then the second biggest thing probably is the size of your league. So whether you're in an 8-person league, in a 10-person league, 12, 14, 16, etc., you're going to have a different answer to this question, because let's look at, for example, one of the extremes, an 8-person league. Well, here, the draft order becomes a little bit more arbitrary if it were a 16-person league, because, the level of elite talent that you're going to have available to you is going to be in a much larger, scope than it would be in a 16-person league. So what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of go ahead and examine that middle ground. And so we're going to focus on 12-team leagues, and we're going to break it up in terms of picks 1 through 4, picks 5 through 8, and then picks 9 through 12. So the reason we're looking at these picks in terms of a range of selections is honestly because it's really difficult to specifically pinpoint a singular pick, whatever the year might be, that is uniquely the best from 1 through 12. That's why when we look at, for example, range 1 through 4 this year, I'd argue that whether you're picking 2nd or 4th overall, you can pretty much put together a very similar type of roster from top to bottom, depending on the strategy that you decide to follow, and that you can have pretty similar player projection expectations from position to position, again, whether you picked 2nd or 4th overall. And now, notice I did bring up the theme of strategies to follow, because whether you realize it or not, the way that we broke out our range of selections here for our picks, each one kind of best sets itself up for a specific type of strategy to be followed. And obviously, this will go ahead and be one of the most personal, biased opinions that someone can have, just because at the end of the video, we'll come up with a specific, pick or range that we'll highlight. But if you want to go ahead and follow a different type of strategy that falls into a different range of selections, then, you might not necessarily agree with our overall message. So that's why I kind of want to look at it from range to range to range, highlight what I think is the best strategy to follow, the best type of position to target at each range. And then you can kind of see what category you fall in, and then decide, oh yeah, I agree, it'll be this range that I say as well is the best range to pick in, or no, maybe I don't agree, but that just means I'll go ahead and focus on these range of picks or that range of picks. And so with that being said, let's look at what each specific range sets itself up for best in terms of draft strategies. So starting with picks 1 through 4 and the strategy associated with this range, it's probably the easiest strategy to kind of go ahead and explain because it's the one that makes the most common sense, at least early on, because every single year you have a kind of projected upper tier echelon of players that are expected to be head and shoulders above the rest. And that's usually the guys that are the safest, the guys that have the least question marks, and on the best offenses. This year in 2019, it's Ezekiel Elliott, Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey. And it's not a coincidence that all of them are running backs because, after all, that is the most important position in fantasy football. So basically, if you're in picks 1 through 4, it's a given. You're going to go ahead and select one of these guys in the first round. And you'll be okay with that because even though afterwards you have to wait a while, you know that you automatically in the first round differentiate yourself from the competition because you have one of these labeled studs that's going to go ahead and probably be better in terms of scoring potential than the guys that go after them. Now, if you're a person that doesn't like to wait that long between their first, second pick, then you probably are already frowning when we're talking about this range of picks. But again, if you do wind up in this selection, I don't think it's a bad thing because, like we said before, running back is the most important position in fantasy football. And the strategy that I would give you guys in the second, third, fourth round, if you were in this range of picks, is usually, at least in 2019, for a 12-team league, what we've seen a lot in mock drafts and via average draft positions from platform to platform is even though you get an elite running back in one of those first 4 picks, there's still a chance that when it comes back to you in the second round, just because of how many deep running backs there are this year within the first 2 rounds, you can still get a good RB1 in the second round. A guy like maybe a Joe Mixon, maybe a Dalvin Cook falls to you. Damian Williams could be there as well. And that's very appealing. Someone like a Nick Chubb. So right from the get-go, you have an elite RB1 and then another mid-level RB1 depending on how you feel about that guy. Again, obviously it comes down to personal preference. So what I usually like to do if I'm in range 1 through 4, I like to come out with 2 running backs. If my second preferred running back is there, obviously, and I don't have to reach on someone. And then in the third round, again, since you don't have to wait that long between your second and third selection overall, you can usually get an upper level wide receiver. Obviously, it won't be an elite level guy. It won't be a Julio Jones, Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, Juju Smith, anything like that. But hey, there's an outside chance that a guy like an Antonio Brown might be there, a guy like a Mike Evans, and those guys are going to be top 10 wide receivers. So basically, what you're doing in ranges 1 through 4 is you ensure yourself a top 5 running back. Then you ensure yourself a top 10 wide receiver. And depending what you want to do with that last pick, with that third pick, you can end up with potentially 2 top 10 wide receivers and a top 5 running back. Again, if you're lucky, or potentially, let's say, 2 top 15 running backs, top 13, 14 running backs. If you're really lucky, 2 top 10 running backs at the end of the day, with one of those guys being a top 4 guy. So again, if you're someone that likes to go ahead and go running back heavy, obviously you can go ahead and accomplish this at whatever point in time if you really set your mind to it. But if you decide to do it in a way that kind of optimizes that approach, then I would say picks 1 through 4 are the best picks for you. Next, we look at picks 5 through 8, and this is where you're going to be considering those next best available running backs, so that tier 1B set of guys, and then potentially starting the run on elite wide receivers. So for 2019 purposes, this would be David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell area, and then also Julio Jones, Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins. And obviously you'd go and select the player at the position that you most wanted, whether it's running back, wide receiver, regardless. But what I will say, even though you just narrowly missed out on the best running backs here, the nice thing is you don't have to wait as long selection to selection from first to second to third to fourth round. You're kind of in that nice middle spot. And you probably set yourself up best for a balanced roster where you don't have to reach on talent because you're scared and you probably know that they're not going to get to you your next selection. So that's a really nice thing to keep in mind. Now, let's just go ahead and say, for example, in the first round, I selected a David Johnson. What I really like about that second round is it's almost guaranteed that you're going to have still an elite level wide receiver. Now, you're potentially going to be sniping picks 1 through 4, and guys like we mentioned, like a Mike Evans or an Antonio Brown, that they could have selected, but that's not your problem. You're going best player available. So again, if I had gone David Johnson, unless someone like that I really like at the running back position dropped to me, I'd be going probably best available wide receiver. Then in the third round, just because this year I really like the third round running backs like an Aaron Jones, like a Leonard Fournette, Devonta Freeman, Kerryon Johnson, I'd probably look at the running back position there. So then let's go ahead and look at picks 9 through 12, because in picks 9 through 12, I will say this is where it can get a little bit difficult because, again, you're at the other extreme of it compared to picks 1 through 4. And the top-notch running backs probably a little bit gone. And probably the top-notch wide receivers have also started to go. So you're not necessarily guaranteed a top-notch, an elite wide receiver or, that next tier of running backs. So again, when it gets to this point, what I usually do is picks 9 through 12, go best player available, whoever is on your big board. Now, just because of the way it works out, you're either going to have one of those next tier of running backs, at least that 9th pick will. Picks 10, 11, and 12 won't be as lucky. So they'll either have a David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, and then whoever is left out of those top 3 wide receivers if they haven't been selected. So they'll have their choosing of one of those guys. But then picks 10, 11, and 12, again, go best player available. What I will say, what most usually happens here most often is if there is someone that goes back-to-back wide receivers, this is the range that will usually happen. Because here, this is where you can load up on guys like a potentially, let's say, Odell Beckham and a Tyreek Hill, a Michael Thomas and an Antonio Brown. And you can do that no problem. The big issue here is that you're really going to be behind the 8 ball when it comes to the running back position in rounds 3 to 4. So what I'll usually do here is if I'm in this range of selection, I kind of have to admit, well, I'll go ahead and land one elite wide receiver and then probably go and reach a little bit on a running back. But again, that's just what happens when you're at these extremes, especially in the first and second round from picks 9 through 12. You have to kind of go ahead and accept that it's probably going to be a reach position, especially if you decide to go that next running back, especially if it doesn't align with, your platform's ADPs. But ultimately, you're going with your own personal rankings. So you might have to reach on someone a little bit, but that's all right because at the end of the day, you're going to be waiting another 20, potentially 24 picks until your next selection. So you're okay with making that choice. You reached a little bit, but you got your guy. So again, what I would probably do is I'd probably go an elite wide receiver, so maybe a Michael Thomas, and then I'd go my next best available running back. So whether that's a James Conner, whether that is a Todd Gurley, a Melvin Gordon, a Joe Mixon, whatever, that'd be my next selection in the second round. And then in the third round, I'd go ahead and look if any of those running backs that we really liked, that we mentioned from range 5 through 8, has made it back to me, and that's who I would target. And from there on out, I kind of go ahead and look at the players that I've put together at that point in time and go best player available and look at need as well. So with all that said, the big question now is, well, what's the best range? What range should I hope for depending on the strategy that I want? And in my personal opinion, the way I like to draft, the players that I like to target, for me, without a question, without a hint of a doubt, it is range 1 through 4. And maybe you expected this, but especially in 2019, I absolutely love this range. Not only do you guarantee yourself an elite running back, but if you're in that pick 3 to 4, which would probably be my preferred selection, if I had to narrow it down even more, you have a much better chance of getting a top 10 wide receiver that made it back down to you, like a Mike Evans, like an Antonio Brown, maybe a Juju Smith-Schuster, like we pointed out before. And then you pretty much go ahead and in the third round guarantee that you will have one of those still very high-end production third round running backs along the lines of a Kerryon Johnson, a Leonard Fournette, Devonta Freeman, Aaron Jones that we have mentioned several times now. And again, the reason that this range happens to work out for me is because I know what I personally like to do, and that is in the first 3 rounds, at least come out with 2 running backs. And the best way to do that for me is not reach on running backs. And in the first 3 rounds, I think, again, the range 1 through 4 sets itself the best way for that. Obviously, right from the start, you have an elite running back as well, which definitely helps. And if you're lucky, you will get that top 10 wide receiver. So even though, you had to wait a while, there's not going to be as huge of a drop off at the running back and wide receiver position. If I had to give you my next preferred range of picks, it would be picks 5 through 8, and then finally finishing it off with picks 9 through 12. So just like in the order that we presented it, I would say the best range 1 through 4, then 5 through 8, then 9 through 12. Again, ultimately, this comes down to personal preference, what you want to do, the type of strategy that you want to follow, the players that you want to target in the first couple of rounds, specifically the position. So with that being said, that pretty much wraps things up. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know your favorite draft position. Let me know, any draft position related questions that you guys might have. If you already know your draft order, let me know who you're considering and maybe I can help you out. Let me hear it in the comments section. And as always, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos.